Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today I'll be taking you through the writing and language section of SAT Practice Test 3. I'll be giving you my tips, tricks, and advice for this section, and I'll also be teaching you grammar rules that you need to know when you take the SAT. I will be showing you answer explanations for each question and how I arrive at my answer, and I will also show you how to use process of elimination to help you refine your answer choices and ultimately find the correct answer. So now let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through each passage, and as I approach a question, I'll show you what I look for, and then I'll ultimately show you the answer and how to solve for it. So, passage 1. Shed some light on the workplace. Studies have shown that employees are happier, healthier, and more productive when they work in an environment in which temperatures are carefully controlled. Well, when I see question 1 here, what I'm looking at is I see we have happier, healthier, and more productive, right? So I'm looking for each of these items in our list to match, right? So we have more productive, healthier, happier. So I know my answer can't be healthy because I have happier. Well, my ending for happier, my IER, has to match my ending for healthier, right? So we know that healthy is out. Well, we have healthier in C, D, and A now. Well, now the question is our punctuation correct? Do we have commas in all three? We do, so we can't eliminate anything based on that. Then we have and they are being more versus just and more. Well, we're told employees are, so we don't need and they are, because that would be repetitive and redundant, so we can get rid of C. And then we would have studies have shown that employees are being more productive. Well, they're not being more productive, they are more productive, right? So we would have studies have shown that employees are more productive when they work in an environment, right? So we go ahead and get rid of D, we know our answer here is going to be A. Alright, now we have when they work in an environment in which temperatures are carefully controlled. So we're asked which choice provides most appropriate introduction to the passage. Well, we haven't quite read the passage yet, so we're actually going to read a little bit more in the introduction here, and then we'll come back and we'll answer that. So we have new buildings may be designed with these studies in mind, but many older buildings were not, resulting in spaces that often depend primarily on artificial lighting. While employers may balk at the expense of reconfiguring such buildings to increase the amount of natural light, the investment has been shown to be well worth it in the long run for both employees and employers. Alright, well, so we're asked for the most appropriate introduction. Well, the most appropriate introduction would lead us into the idea that allowing more natural light is a good thing and it's positive for businesses, right? So we'll go ahead and find what answer choice tells us that. Well, we have more productive when they work in an environment in which temperatures are carefully controlled. Well, we're not talking about temperatures, we're talking about light. So we can get rid of A. Then we have B, that affords them adequate amounts of natural light. Well, that's what we just discussed on our own. We like to come to our own answer before we look at our answer choices because then we're not swayed by answer choices. We don't click the wrong one on accident because it's part right. Part right is not right. We need it to be all right. So then we have C, that is thoroughly sealed to prevent energy loss. We're not discussing energy loss at this point. And then we have in which they feel comfortable asking managers for special accommodations. That's not the main idea. Our main idea is about amount of natural light. For one thing, lack of exposure to natural light has a significant impact on employees' health. A study conducted in 2013 by Northwestern University in Chicago showed that inadequate natural light could result in eye strain, headaches, fatigue, as well as interference with the body's circadian rhythms. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Workers in offices with windows sleep an average of 46 minutes more per night than workers who work in offices without windows. So should the writer make this addition here? Well, let's read our next sentence so we can make a proper conclusion about whether they should add the sentence. So we end our last sentence, our previous sentence, with circadian rhythms. Well, now next we start with circadian rhythms and we start explaining them, right? So we wouldn't really want to interrupt that, right? So as we read, we see interference with the body's circadian rhythms, which are controlled by the body's biological clocks, influence body temperature, hormone release, cycles of sleep and wakefulness, and other bodily functions. Well, since we end with circadian rhythms and then we explain it, we don't want to interrupt that, right? So our answer is going to be C. We don't want to add this sentence because it interrupts the discussion of circadian rhythms. Alright, now we have our question here. So we have, which are controlled by the body's biological clocks. Well, which are controlled by the body's biological clock? The body's needs to be possessive, right? Because it's their biological clocks. So we can go ahead and get rid of no change. And then we have possessive in B, C, and D. But the question is it a singular body or is it plural, right? So as we read, we see that we have circadian rhythms, which are controlled by the body's biological clock. Well, it's just one body, right? It's the body of one individual. It's their biological clocks, right? So we're going to have to eliminate B. So now we're left with C and D. If we look at the differences between these two, we can see we have an apostrophe S in clocks, but we don't need that. Clocks doesn't own anything, so there shouldn't be an apostrophe there. So we know our answer is going to be C. Disruptions of circadian rhythms have been linked to sleep disorders, diabetes, depression, and bipolar disorder. Like any other health problem, these ailments can increase employee absenteeism, which in turn is costly for employers. Okay, so we're just looking if this word needs to be changed, right? We have one word underlined, so we're looking to see if it needs to be changed. Well, as I read through this, I didn't see that it needed to be changed. So I'm going to go ahead and put a check mark by no change because that's what it appeared to be correct on my first glance. Now I'm going to go through, I'm going to look for grammar, right? So what if I plugged in are is being or have been for that word? Let's see if it makes sense in any of the cases. Like any other health problems, these ailments can increase employee absenteeism, which in turn are costly for employers? No. Employee absenteeism is costly for employers. Not is being and not have been. It is. So our answer is going to be A. Employees who feel less than 100% and are sleep deprived are less prone to work at their maximal productivity. One company in California gained a huge boost in its employees' morale when it moved from an artificially lit distribution facility to one with natural illumination. So we're asked which choice best supports the statement made in the previous sentence. So in the previous sentence, we were told that workers who have less sleep and don't feel 100% aren't as productive. Well, now we're told that a company that switched to natural light gained a huge boost in its employees' morale. But we're looking for productivity, not morale. So A is going to be out. We're looking for an answer that talks about an increase in productivity, which is B. Question 7 asks us, in context, which choice best combines the underlined sentences. So we're looking to combine our underlined sentences, but another thing we know is we see we're starting a new paragraph here. So what we want to do is when we start a new paragraph, we want to have a good transition from the last sentence of our other paragraph, right? So if we look at our last sentence, it was one company in California gained a huge boost or saw a 5% increase in productivity when it moved from an artificially lit distribution facility to one with natural illumination. So we want to link our increase in productivity with our two underlined sentences, right? So we're going to look at our answer choices after we read our two sentences, and we're going to look for one that transitions us from worker productivity into what this paragraph is going to talk about, right? So we have artificial light sources are also costly aside from lowering worker productivity. They typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. Well, what we're looking for now, we're looking for something that transitions us from worker productivity over to cost savings on energy. So over to energy savings. And it also has to combine our two sentences, right? So we have A, aside from lowering worker productivity, so that checks our first box of starting with productivity. Artificial light sources are also costly, typically constituting anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. Well, this fits our productivity to energy savings, so we're going to go ahead and put a check mark by it, and we're just going to check our other three options just to make sure that we're confident A is our answer. So we're going to go ahead and figure out ways we can eliminate other answer choices, right, just to make sure. So we have B, the cost of artificial light sources, aside from lowering worker productivity, typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. Well, what do we see here? We're starting with the cost, right? We want to start with productivity because we're linking our last paragraph to this one. So B is out. And then C, we have typically constituting 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. Once again, we want to start with productivity and then transition to energy savings. And then D, we have artificial lights, which lower worker productivity and are costly, typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. Well, starting our paragraph with artificial lights isn't the greatest transition, right? We kind of want to start by shifting our idea, right? Instead of just starting out with artificial lights like that. So D is going to be out, and a better choice than D is A, because we have a good transition. We have aside from lowering worker productivity, which is discussed in the paragraph above, Artificial light sources are also costly, typically constituting anywhere from 25 to 50% of the building's energy use. So now we have when a plant in Seattle, Washington was redesigned for more natural light, the company was able to enjoy annual electricity cost reductions of $500,000 each year. Well, what do we know? We know we already have annual cost reductions. That means each year, so we don't need each year. So we're looking for delete the underlined portion and end the sentence with a period. And this goes back to one of my big tips, which is eliminate redundancy and repetition. We don't want to repeat things we've already said. We don't want to be redundant, right? We want to be efficient with our word choice. So we're going to go ahead and pick D there. All right. Among the possibilities to reconfigure a building's lighting is the installation of full pane windows to allow the greatest degree of sunlight to reach office interiors. Okay, now we have a word underlined at the beginning of a sentence, which means we're looking for a transition from our previous sentence into the sentence we're on. So we have, thus businesses can install light tubes. Well, we just talked about full pane windows allowing more sunlight to reach office interiors. So we can't say thus businesses can install light tubes, because we would want businesses to install full pane windows, right, if we want the greatest degree of sunlight. So thus isn't going to work. We're looking for an alternative, right? So our answer is going to be alternatively, because if we can't install our full pane windows, it says that we can install light tubes. So we're given an alternative. So our answer there is going to be C. So alternatively, business can install light tubes, and then it gives us a comma. These are pipes. Well, if we have a comma here, it's going to be which are pipes, right? Because what we're doing is we're explaining what these light tubes are, right? So we're not going to say these are pipes placed in workplace roofs. We're going to say light tubes, which are pipes placed in workplace roofs to capture and funnel sunlight down into a building's interior, right? So this is going to be our non-essential phrase or clause, which means we have to have a comma after light tubes, and then we explain what the light tubes are, right? And when we do that, it's going to be usually a who, a which, right? So if it was like a person, it'd be who was the president of the United States in 1960, or which are pipes placed in workplace roofs, right? So we're usually looking for a who or a which in those situations. All right, so we got C there. Now we move on. We got glass walls and dividers can also be used to replace solid walls as a means of, right? When we have one word underlined in the middle of the sentence, as I read through, I'm going to go ahead and try and fill in that word as I read by anticipating what word would come next after my previous word. So after I read means and see the next word's underlined, I'm going to go ahead and fill it in with what I would anticipate if I were writing this essay. If I were writing this, what would I put? So as I read it, I see it as a means of distributing natural light more freely. And we see that'll be our answer, right? We have B there. If we think about it, that makes sense, right? Because we need a means of distributing it. Not a means through distributing the natural light, but a means of distributing it, like a way to distribute it, right? So our answer there is going to be B. Considering the enormous cost of artificial lighting, both in terms of money and productivity, investment in such improvements should be a natural choice for businesses. All right, transforming the American West through food and hospitality. Just as travelers making road trips today may need to take a break for food at a rest area along the highway, settlers traversing the American West by train in the mid-1800s often found themselves in need of refreshment. Well, as I read through this and I saw my word underlined in the middle of the sentence, I didn't see anything particularly wrong with it, right? So I'm actually going to go ahead and put a check there, because we have themselves and we have travelers taking road trips today may need a break for food at a rest area along the highway. Settlers, so settlers is going to be our noun. Settlers traversing the American West by train in the mid-1800s often found themselves, right? So we have settlers and themselves. It's not going to be settlers and then himself or herself, or settlers and their selves, or settlers and oneself, right? It's going to be settlers and themselves. So when we have a question like this, whether it's their or its or themselves versus oneself or something like that, we want to go back and we want to find our noun, our subject that we are using our pronoun in, right? So here it's going to be A. All right. However, food available on rail lines was generally of terrible quality. Despite having worked for railroad companies, Fred Harvey, Okay, so we need a modifier or an introductory phrase describing Fred Harvey is what we need there. So we're asked which choice provides the most logical introduction to the sentence, so we have to read our rest of our sentence. Fred Harvey, an English-born entrepreneur, and then we're going to have decided to open his own restaurant business to serve rail customers, right? So what introduces this the best, right? What introduces Fred Harvey the best? Well, it's not despite having worked for railroad companies, because that doesn't really have anything to do with him being an entrepreneur who decides to open his own restaurant. Him living in New York and New Orleans doesn't really have anything to do with it. Plus, we would have then a comma, so Fred Harvey, comma, an English-born entrepreneur, and that doesn't work grammatically. Well, and then we have, to capitalize on the demand for great food, Fred Harvey, an English-born entrepreneur, decided to open his own restaurant business to serve rail customers. And that fits our sentence, right? So that's what we're going to choose. So that's going to be C. All right, so now we have, to capitalize on the demand for good food, Fred Harvey, an English-born entrepreneur, decided to open his own restaurant business to serve rail customers. Now, you see how we have this period here, and we have our underlined word after it, our underlined word before it. So we're probably looking to merge these sentences together when we see that. So as I read through and I read an English-born entrepreneur, Fred Harvey, an English-born entrepreneur, decided to open his own restaurant. You see how I just automatically got rid of he as I was reading? Well, there's a reason for that. I got rid of that he as I was reading because it was unnecessary, because we're already told Fred Harvey, and then this an English-born entrepreneur with a comma after entrepreneur. That's just describing our Fred Henry, right? So that's just our non-essential phrase describing Fred Henry. So we can take that out. So now when we take that out, what we're left with is Fred Harvey decided to open his own restaurant business to serve rail customers. So when we have a comma there and a comma there, we can eliminate that because it's not essential and read it as Fred Harvey decided to open his own restaurant. So our answer there is going to be D. All right. Beginning in the 1870s, he opened dozens of restaurants and rail stations and dining cars. These Harvey houses, which constituted the first restaurant chain in the United States, were unique. Right? It's not going to be these Harvey houses was unique, so they were unique. And what we see is we have another non-essential phrase here. Right? We have a comma there and a comma there, which means that as we read this, when we're looking to solve grammatically, right here, what we do is we read these Harvey houses were unique for their, right? Because it's plural houses, so we can't have a singular its. So we know its is out. So we can get rid of D, we can get rid of A, and we know we have there, and we know it has to be were, right? So our answer there is going to be B. Okay. The menu was modeled after those of fine restaurants, so the food was leagues behind the sinister fare travelers were accustomed to receiving in transit. So here we have a question about vocabulary, right? And about word choice. So we have, so the food was leagues beyond the sinister fare. Well, sinister would kind of just imply evil, right? And we aren't really talking about the food as evil. So we want to maintain the tone established in the passage. Well, A does not, right? Icky, that's too informal, right? This passage isn't like a scientific article, but it's also not like you're just at a restaurant talking to your friends, right? So you're not going to use icky. Now you're left with surly, and abysmal. Well, if you don't know what surly means, but you know what abysmal means, if we were to think about it like this, so the food was leagues beyond the abysmal fare travelers were accustomed to receiving in transit. Well, abysmal means basically terrible, right? So the food was leagues beyond, much better than the terrible food that travelers were accustomed to receiving. So we can go ahead and pick C as our answer. His restaurants were immediately successful, but Harvey was not content to follow conventional business practices. Now we're asked, the writer is considering deleting the previous sentence. Should the writer make this change? Well, when we have the first sentence in a paragraph, we want it to do two things. We want it to transition properly from our previous paragraph to our new paragraph, and we also want it to introduce the ideas that follow. So what we need to do is we need to read on to see if it properly introduces the ideas that follow, because we already know it does a good job of transitioning from our previous paragraph, because in our previous paragraph we talked about the Harvey houses, and now we're talking about Harvey's restaurants, the Harvey houses, right, and how they were immediately successful. So that's a proper transition from our previous paragraph up here to our current paragraph. But the only question now is, does it properly introduce the ideas that come in this paragraph? So we have, although women did not traditionally work in restaurants in the 19th century, Harvey decided to try employing women as waitstaff. In 1883, he placed an advertisement seeking educated, well-mannered, articulate young women between the ages of 18 and 30. Response to the advertisement was overwhelming, even tremendous. Alright, well when I read this, what I see, I have overwhelming, even tremendous. That's repetitive. Those two words are too similar. We don't need both of them. So any answer choice I see that has both of them, I can get rid of, because that's repetitive and it's redundant. And the two things that we want to avoid big time on the SAT writing section are repetitiveness and redundancy, right? So we want to get rid of one or the other. So I look at my answer choices, A is automatically out because it has both. Now I look at my other choices, I see we have B with just overwhelming, so that's good, right? So I put a check by that because that's probably our answer. I look at C, we have overwhelming and tremendous, which means I'm not going to pick it. And I look at D, we have overwhelming and tremendous, so I'm not going to pick it. So my answer is going to be B. And Harvey soon replaced the male servers at his restaurants with women. Those who were hired as Harvey girls joined an elite group of workers who were expected to complete a 30-day training program and follow a strict code of rules for conduct and curfews. In the workplace, the women donned identical black and white uniforms and carried out their duties with precision. Not only were such regulations meant to ensure the efficiency of the business and the safety of the workers, but also helped, well, here's what I see as a problem here. I see I have a comma and a but. So when I see that, I'm looking for an independent clause to follow, because we're going to have a compound sentence then, right? Because we have a comma followed by a fanboy. So we have comma, but, so I know I need an independent clause here. But then I see I have, but also helped to raise people's generally low opinion of the restaurant industry. Well, what's the problem with this? The problem is, although we have a verb in helped, we don't have a subject here. So we have to have a subject. We have to have what helped to raise people's generally low opinion of the restaurant industry. Well, what helped to raise their opinion? The Harvey girls, right? So it would be, but they also helped. We can't have also helping because there's no subject. We can't have but also helping because there's no subject. And we can't have no change because there's no subject there either. So our answer has to be D. And now we can go back up to 17. And we have to remember that we're asked if we should delete our intro sentence. Well, what does our introduction and our introductory sentence say? Well, we have his restaurants were immediately successful, which provides a proper transition from previous paragraph to this one. And then we have, but Harvey was not content to follow conventional business practices. Well, what were the conventional business practices he didn't follow? That women didn't traditionally work in restaurants, and he started hiring them. So this is a proper introduction of the ideas that follow it. So yes, we are not going to delete it, or I'm sorry. So as far as deleting it, should the writer make this change? No, the writer should not delete it. So we can get rid of both choices with yes. So we know he's not going to delete it, right? So now we need the proper reason for why he shouldn't delete it. And the proper reason is that it provides a logical introduction to the paragraph, right? If we look at D, it would be no, because it provides a specific example in support of arguments made elsewhere in the passage. This argument hasn't been made elsewhere in the passage yet. We've only had one paragraph prior to this, and it was really just introducing the idea of Harvey houses. So our answer D is not going to be correct. We know our answer will be C because it provides a logical introduction to the paragraph. And now we can move on. In return for their server's work, the position paid quite well for the time, $17.50 a month, plus tips, meals, room and board, laundry service, and travel expenses. Now we're asked for which choice most logically follows the previous sentence. So we're just going to go ahead and start and just go down our list, right? So we have the growth of Harvey's business coincided with the expansion of the Santa Fe Railway, which served large sections of the American West. Well, that's kind of unrelated to what we're talking about. At this point, we're talking about the Harvey houses and the Harvey girls, right? And then B, Harvey would end up opening dozens of restaurants and dining cars, plus 15 hotels over his lucrative career. Well, we're not really talking about Harvey in that paragraph. We're talking about the Harvey girls, right? And then in C, we have these benefits enabled the Harvey girls to save money and build a new and exciting lives for themselves in the so-called Wild West. So that looks like it's going to be our answer. We read D just to make sure. The compensation was considered excellent at the time. We're already told that, so saying that would be redundant and repetitive. We don't want to do that. So our answer is going to be C. For as long as the Harvey houses served rail travelers through the mid-20th century, working there was a steady and lucrative position for women. Living independently and demonstrating an intense work ethic, well, we know we don't want to have our semicolon there, right? And here's why. Because living independently and demonstrating an intense work ethic is describing the Harvey girls, and it's not an independent clause. So we can't have a semicolon there. Because a semicolon splits an independent clause from another independent clause. But we know that this is not an independent clause, right? So we know we can't have a semicolon there. and we know it has to describe the Harvey girls, so we can go ahead and get rid of A. And now we're left with B, C, and D. So if we look at our answers, we need something that allows our modifier living independently and demonstrating an intense work ethic, comma, the Harvey girls, right? So D would be our answer choice that allows our modifier living independently and demonstrating an intense work ethic, comma, the Harvey girls. It allows this whole section to go ahead and modify and describe the Harvey girls, right? So our answer there is going to be D. Our answer is not going to be B because we would need an independent clause before it, and we don't have that as we discussed. And our answer for C also isn't, because if we have comma and, we would also need an independent clause before it, which we don't have. So our answer choice is D. The Harvey girls became known as a transformative force in the American West. Okay, now we're asked, the writer is considering revising the underlined portion of the sentence to read, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a musical. Should the writer make this addition here? Alright, well, let's see. The Harvey girls became known as a transformative force in the American West. Now we're asked, should we include that they inspired books, documentaries, and even a musical? Well, let's read our answer choices, because we don't really have a definitive way to go on this one yet. So we have A, yes, because it provides examples of their influence. That certainly could be correct. Now if we look at B, yes, because it serves as a transitional point in the paragraph. Well, it doesn't, right? We're not transitioning in the paragraph there, right? We're just talking about how they're a transformative force and how they advanced the roles of women in the industry and workforce as a whole. So we're not shifting points, we're adding, right? We're talking about how it was lucrative and it became a transformative force in the American West. So we already have that as a transformative force, and then we talk more about how it was transformative. So it's not a turning point in our paragraph. Alright, so now we have no, because it should be placed earlier in the passage. No, because this would actually, if we were going to include it, that would be an ideal time. And then we have no, because it contradicts the main claim. It does not, right? It talks about how the Harvey girls were transformative in the Midwest, or in the West. So that's not going to be our answer. We're left with A, yes, because it provides examples of their influence, and we're talking about their transformative power, right? So that's going to be our answer there. How do you like those apples? Marketed as Smart Fresh, the chemical 1-MCP, 1-methyl-cyclopropene, has been used by fruit growers since 2002 in the United States and elsewhere to preserve the crispness and lengthen the storage life of apples and other fruit, which often must travel long distances before being eaten by consumers. Now we're asked which choice most effectively combines our underlined sentences. So we go ahead and we read our underlined sentences, and then we go from shortest answer to longest answer to find which sentence flows logically across the timeline and also is grammatically correct. So we have 1-MCP lengthens storage life by 3 to 4 times when applied to apples. This extended life allows producers to sell their apples in the off-season months after the apples have been harvested. So we see our shortest answers here are C and D. So we'll start with C. 1-MCP lengthens storage life when applied to apples by 3 to 4 times. Well, 1-MCP lengthening the storage life comes after it's applied to apples. The most logical sequence would having us apply to apples first, which then lengthens our storage life by 3 to 4 times, right? So this one doesn't follow as good of a sequence of events as we'd like. So now we check D. The D we start with months after apples have been harvested, but that's kind of our last idea, right? We want to start with applying 1-MCP to apples. Now we go up, we see B has 5 lines, so that's going to be our last answer that we read. And we see right here we have 4 lines, so we can go ahead and read A. We have when applied to apples, 1-MCP lengthens storage life by 3 to 4 times, allowing producers to sell their apples in the off-season months after the apples have been harvested. Well, we're starting with when applied to apples, which is our first thing in our sequence of events. Then we are lengthening storage life by 3 to 4 times, so we're progressing logically across our timeline. Then we're allowing producers to sell their apples in the off-season, and then that we're including that's months after the apples have been harvested. So we follow our timeline, it flows logically, and it's grammatically correct, so A will be our answer. Alright, now we begin reading again. So we have, and at a cost of about 1 cent per pound of apples, 1-MCP is a highly cost-effective treatment. However, 1-MCP is not a panacea for fruit producers or sellers. There are problems and limitations associated with its use. Okay, now we see we have a 1 at the beginning of this, which means that we are going to be looking for a sentence and we're going to have to place it. So we go ahead and find that question. Okay, we see it's 30. We're asked about sentence 4, making the paragraph most logical, where it should be placed. So we go ahead and read sentence 4. Sentence 4 says but, which means that we're going to have contrast. So we're going to contrast one idea with the next. Some fruits do not respond as well to 1 MCP as others do. And we can go ahead and get rid of that did, put do, and we can actually go ahead and answer that question, which is going to be 28. And we know that because we have some fruits do not respond as well to M1CP as other fruits do, right? Okay, so we're looking for something where we're talking first about fruits that respond well. And we know this because we have a contrast transition of but. And then we're going into something where it talks about fruits that don't respond well. So fruits that don't respond well to 1 MCP will come after. Alright. So we have 1 MCP works by limiting a fruit's production of ethylene. And it's not going to be it is a chemical. When we see this comma and then we're defining a term listed before the comma, we don't need to have it is. We just have a chemical because we're just providing a definition for ethylene. So we're actually going to delete the underlined portion. Alright, now we have sentence 2. Well, 1 MCP keeps apples tight and crisp. Well, tight and crisp, no one really ever calls an apple tight, right? We call apples firm. So our answer there is going to be B. We don't want to use language that doesn't apply to an apple, right? We kind of want to use a common way to show that apples are fresh, right? If it's fresh, it's firm, and it's crisp, right? So our answer there is going to be B. And then we have it also limits there, and we know that this is the correct form of there, and also that it isn't going to be its because it's talking about apples, right? So apples is our noun here. Apples is plural, so we need to have there because there is plural as well. Alright, now keep in mind we have to place sentence 4 where we talk about apples responding well to 1 MCP and then put it between where it doesn't respond well, right? So we see that we have sentence 1 talking about it responds well, and we have sentence 2 saying that it limits their scent production, right? So now we can go ahead and realize that sentence 2 is saying it limits their scent production, so that's an adverse response, or in other words, it doesn't respond well. So that fits what we identified in sentence 4. So sentence 4 is going to come between sentence 1 and 2. So now we can go find that answer on question 30. It will come after sentence 1. Okay, now we have sentence 3. This may not be much of a problem with certain kinds of apples that are not naturally very fragrant, such as Granny Smith, but for apples that are prized for their fruity fragrance, such as Macintosh, this can be a problem with consumers who will reject apples lacking the expected aroma, right? Consumers is our noun here, and we're given our comma. We're going to go ahead and say who, right? We wouldn't say consumers that, we would say consumers who will reject the apples lacking the expected aroma. Because this who will reject apples lacking the expected aroma is modifying our consumers, right? So our answer there is going to be who, and that'll be 27. Furthermore, some fruits, particularly those that naturally produce a large amount of ethylene, do not respond as well to 1 MCP treatment. Take Bartlett pears for instance. Unless they are treated with exactly the right amount of 1 MCP at exactly the right time, they will remain hard and green until they rot, and consumers who experience this will be unlikely to purchase them again. Alright, so what we're doing here is in the second part of our sentence, we're giving an example that illustrates our idea that we introduced in the beginning, right? So we start out with taking Bartlett pears, for instance, as a fruit that does not respond well to 1 MCP treatment. But then the second part of our sentence is illustrating that idea by giving our example of how unless they're treated with exactly the right amount at exactly the right time, they remain hard and green until they rot. So we're illustrating the idea in that first part in our second part. And when we do this, we use a colon to separate it, right? So our answer there is going to be B. So we can go ahead and get rid of everything with a comma, which would be A, C, and D, and we'll answer with B. All right. And then we already answered 30, so we can go ahead and move on to question 31. Finally, researchers have found that 1-MCP actually increases susceptibility to some pathologies in certain apple varieties. For example, Empire apples are prone to a condition that causes the flesh of the apple to turn brown. Traditionally, apple producers have dealt with this problem by leaving the apples in the open air for 3 weeks before storing them in a controlled atmosphere, with tightly regulated temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels. As the graph shows, the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are first stored in the open air undergoes, and then we have to answer which choice offers an accurate interpretation of the data in the graph. And we're comparing the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are first stored in open air versus the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are immediately put into storage in a controlled environment. So now we're going to look at our answer choices, find which one supports the graph, which one is supported by the data in the graph. Alright, so we're just going to go down our list. So we have, to start with, we're going to look at the flesh of untreated Empire apples, first stored in open air, and then compare that to the flesh of untreated apples that are immediately put into storage. So go ahead and find our graph. Alright, so we're going to be using untreated apples, and we're comparing those immediately placed in controlled atmosphere versus those placed in a controlled atmosphere after 3 weeks of air. We see that they're vastly different, and we know our answer choice said only 5% different, right? So that's going to be wrong. And then we have slightly more browning, twice as much, or substantially less. We know our answer is substantially less. Okay, however, when Empire apples are treated with 1-MCP, their flesh turns brown when the apples are first stored in the open air, though not under other conditions. And we're asked again for an accurate interpretation of the data in the graph. So we're looking for Empire apples that are treated, and we're looking to compare the flesh browning of the ones that are first stored in open air and the ones that are not. So now, instead of dealing with our gray box, we're dealing with our black box, or our black bar graph. So if we look at them, we see that they are roughly equal, with the apples placed in the controlled atmosphere after 3 weeks in open air being slightly above it, but we see that they're roughly equal. So we go back in, and if we look at our answer choices, we see that answer choice A says that they don't turn brown under other conditions, which they do. Answer choice B says roughly half of their flesh turns brown regardless of whether the apples are first stored in the open air, which is true. They were both around 50%. Question 33. The writer wants a conclusion that conveys how the shortcomings of 1-MCP presented in the passage affect the actions of people in the fruit industry. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? Alright, well, we got to go back so we can get that first part of the sentence. So we have, although researchers continue to search for the right combination of factors that will keep fruits fresh and attractive, the problem may be that consumers are overly concerned with superficial qualities rather than the actual freshness of our fruit. Well, that's not going to be right because we're looking for the actions of people in the fruit industry. So we're talking about fruit producers, right? People who are farming fruit and operating in the fruit industry. A is talking about consumers being overly concerned about qualities, but that's not what our main idea is in this conclusion. So if we look at answer choice B, we have many of the improvements to fruit quality they have discovered so far have required trade-offs in other properties of the fruit. Well, we want to be more talking about the actions of the people in the fruit industry in response to the shortcomings of 1-MCP. But that's not really talking about it, right? What happens with the people in the fruit industry is they're having to weigh what the consumers want with how they can increase their crop yield, right? So if we look at answer choice C, we have for many fruit sellers, many fruit sellers must weigh the relative values of aroma, color, and freshness. So they're weighing what consumers want when deciding to use 1-MCP, which is what we stated, and that'll be our correct answer. Alright, more than one way to dress a cat. From Michelangelo's David to Vincent van Gogh's series of self-portraits to Grant Wood's iconic image of a farming couple in American Gothic, these works, well, when we see the end of a sentence with a period followed by the beginning of the next sentence. We're usually looking for a grammar error or to combine these sentences. If we look at combining these sentences, we see in the beginning here we have from Michelangelo's David to Vincent van Gogh's series of portraits to Grant Wood's iconic image of a farming couple in American Gothic. We know that that is not a sentence, right? Because we're just giving a dependent clause, right? It's from Michelangelo's David to Vincent van Gogh's series of self-portraits to Grant Wood's iconic image of a farming couple in American Gothic. There's no subject verb, right? So it's not a sentence because it doesn't have a subject and a verb. So not a sentence or an independent clause, right? And when you see ID, I just mean independent clause. So we know that we can't end it with a period. So it means we can get rid of A and B. We know we can't use a semicolon because it's not an independent clause. So our answer has to be D. And then we have, these works by human artists have favored representations of members of their own species to those of other species. Indeed, when we think about animals depicted in well-known works of art, the images of dog playing poker, popularized in a series of paintings by American artist C.M. Coolidge, may be the first and only one that comes to mind. Well, when I see this here, I know I have my M dash setting off my non-essential phrase or clause, popularized in a series of paintings by American artist C.M. Coolidge, and since I have an M dash here, I also have to have an M dash here to properly end that non-essential phrase or clause. So we can go ahead and answer B, and we move on. Maybe the first and only one that comes to mind, yet some of the earliest known works of art, including paintings and drawings tens of thousands of years old found on cave walls in Spain and France, portray animals. And here's how I know it's portray. When we see our comma here and we see our comma here, we know this is going to be our non-essential phrase or clause, which means as we read the sentence, we go, yet some of the earliest known works of art. Okay, so works of art is going to be my noun, portray is going to be my verb. Well, works of art is plural, right? So we would say works of art portray animals. Not portrays animals, the works of art portray animals, right? And another way to think about it is when we see works of art, we got works of art, that's going to be plural. So if you weren't sure whether to use portray or portrays, what you'd do is you'd go ahead and think of a word that's plural, right? So we could say they, right? And we'll do they portray, right? So we see you have a plural noun, and then we need to have the plural form of the verb, right? So it'd be portray. If we were to say he, we'd say he portrays, right? So this would be singular, and in that case we'd use portrays. But we know works of art's plural, so we know our answer has to be portray. Alright, nor has artistic homage to our fellow creatures entirely died out in the millennia since. Despite the many years that have passed between then and now, well, we don't need that, right? Because that's just redundant, because we said in the millennia since. So the writer wants to link the first paragraph with the ideas that follow. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? Well, we need to know the ideas that follow before we can answer this. We can get rid of A because that's just redundant, so we're not going to say that no matter what. But now we need to go read through the rest, so we'll read through the next paragraph and come back. Alright. The State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, one of Russia's greatest art museums, has long had a productive partnership with a much-loved animal, the cat. For centuries, cats have guarded this famous museum, ridding it of mice, rats, and other rodents that could damage the art, not to mention scare off visitors. And we know that this is scare off because they have guarded this famous museum, ridding it of mice and other rodents that could damage the art. And we're using parallelism here to know that if we have damaged the art, we also have to have scare off visitors, right? Other rodents that could damage the art, not to mention that they could scare off visitors. No D. Alright, now if we go back and we look at question 37, we saw that we opened up with an example of a museum in Russia, right? The St. Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. So that's what we're going to want to use to link our introduction to our next paragraph. So our answer for that one is going to be D. Alright, so now we're asked about sentence 5, so we go ahead and read that. Continuing the tradition, Peter's daughter, Elizaveta introduced the best and strongest cats in Russia to the Hermitage. Okay, so we're looking for something with Peter, right? So we're going to try and place sentence 5 after the sentence with Peter. So we go back to where we left off. We have Peter the Great introduced the first cat to the Hermitage in the early 18th century. So we know we're going to want to have sentence 5 come after the sentence with Peter. So sentence 5 will come after sentence 3. So our answer is going to be C there. Alright, and then we'll go ahead and keep reading from sentence 4. Later, Catherine the Great declared the cats to be official guardians of the galleries. Now we go down to sentence 6. Today, the museum holds a yearly festival honoring these faithful workers. These cats are so cherished by the museum that officials recently decreed original paintings be made of 6 of them. Well, as we read this, we see we have one word underlined in the middle of the sentence, which means we're looking to replace the word, or if it makes sense, we'd go no change, but it doesn't make sense, right? When we think of decree, we would think of a lawmaker or a governor back in like the 1400s decreeing that something is now a law, but that's not what happened, right? The cats were so cherished by the museum that officials recently commissioned original paintings to be made of 6 of them, right? The museum officials are saying, hey, we're going to hire these painters, they're going to make these paintings of these cats. They're not forcing them to do this, and they're not licensing it, right? Licensing would be like if you had written a song and you were going to want to get a copyright on it, and then you wanted to license it out for someone else to use in, say, a mixtape or a CD or something like that, right? Or maybe Spotify wanted a license to a song, something like that. So licensing is not going to be what's happening, right? They're commissioning or asking painters, hiring painters to paint the picture, right, of the cats. So that's going to be a commission there. In each, a cat is depicted upright in a human-like pose and clothed in imperial-era Russian attire. The person chosen for this task, digital artist Eldar Zakharov, painted the cats in the style traditionally used by portrait artists. Well, if we look at this, when we see digital artist Eldar Zakharov, that's all one noun phrase, so we do not need this comma. So we can go ahead and get rid of A and B because they each have that comma there. And then now, if we look at answer choices C and D, we have to determine if we need a comma after task. And we do, because our noun phrase digital artist Eldar Zakharov acts as an A positive, identifying the person chosen for this task, right? So that means we will need that comma there. Alright. In so doing, presenting the cats as noble individuals worthy of respect. So we're asked for which choice effectively sets up the examples that follow, so we need to know our examples first. We have one portrait. The Hermitage court chamber herald cat includes an aristocratic tilt of feline ears as well as a stately sweep of tail emerging from the stiff scarlet and gold of royal court dress. The wise, thoughtful green eyes of the subject of the Hermitage court outrunner cat mimic those of a trusted royal advisor. Some may find it peculiar to observe cats portrayed in formal court poses, but these felines are Alright, and we can come back to that later if we answer question 42. So we clearly see that all those examples were depicting these cats as individuals that were noble, right? Like they were royals, had expensive clothes. So we can go ahead and look at our answer choices, right? So if we look at A, we have presenting the cats as noble individuals worthy of respect, which is what we're talking about, right? They're talking about them as royals, worthy of respect. If we look at our other answer choices, we have B, managing to capture unique characteristics of each cat. That's not really the point, right? The point is to depict them as royals, right? As people worthy of respect. And then C, commenting on the absurdity of dressing up cats in royal robes. That's not even close. And then we have D, indicating that the cats were very talented catchers. That's not the point of it, right? The point of dressing them up in robes and having them depicted as royals is to show that they're worthy of respect. Alright, now we're on question 43, and we're asked at this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. The museum occupies 6 historic buildings, including the Winter Palace, a former residence of Russian emperors. Well, if we think about what we're talking about right here, we're talking about the paintings of these cats. So we don't really need to include any historical details about the museum at this point, because we're talking about the paintings of the cats, right? And then if we look at the sentence that would come after it, we see that it says, some may find it peculiar to observe cats portrayed in formal court poses, but these felines, and then we're going to have to fill that in, are benefactors of the museum as important as any human. Well, we're really focused on the cats here. We don't really want to be talking about the history of the museum and how many buildings it occupies, right? So our answer here, we're not going to make this addition because it blurs the focus of the paragraph. So we're going to look for what answer choice says that, and that will be D, right? It's irrelevant to the paragraph because it provides background information that's irrelevant. All right, and now we have our final question, 44. But these felines, by mastering the art of killing mice and rats, are benefactors of the museum as important as any human. Well, them killing the mice and rats isn't really why they're such benefactors of the museum. It's because of what they're protecting in there, right? Not just killing the rats or acting as a predator in the museum's ecosystem, right? It's by protecting the museum's priceless artworks from destructive rodents, which will be D. Thank you for watching Preeminent Test Prep. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share as we will be releasing more videos to help you prepare for the SAT.